Hey everyone, I'm Shade Tree Pastor, and welcome to another 5 Minutes in the Bible. Today we're going to be talking about a few statements that Jesus made in his famous Sermon on the Mount and what those have to teach us about judgment and legalism and hypocrisy. First, I'm going to start with a little story. Happened to be scrolling through TikTok the other day, follow a lot of religious content, and so the algorithm's always pushing some religious content on me. And I saw something by a very ultra conservative Baptist preacher. This guy's a King James only, drinking and smoking are a sin, women should wear dresses type of preacher. And in that sermon, he said that there were too many pastors afraid to speak the truth. And in fact, he called these pastors that were, in his mind, afraid to speak the truth, he called them emasculated puppets. Now, I am going to be honest, that gets under my skin a little bit. Because I know what he really means when he says that, and I know that he is referring in a very real sense to pastors like me. So of course, my first reaction, my first temptation is always to sort of react out of anger and be like, yeah, if you think I'm not man enough, you're welcome to step on the mats with me anytime, buddy. I train judo and jujitsu. I've medaled in wrestling, judo, and jujitsu. Like, if you think I'm not man enough, you're free to test that assumption at your convenience. But I know that's not the right response. Instead, I thought, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what he really means. First of all, when he, and I would hazard to guess 90% of every other pastor, when they ever say something like, other pastors are afraid to preach the truth, here's what they actually mean. They don't mean he's afraid to preach the gospel. They don't mean he's afraid to preach about forgiveness of sins. They don't mean he's afraid to preach about Christian freedom. Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ set us free, even though very oftentimes it does take courage to preach on those topics. No, that's not what he means. What they almost always, if not always, mean is you're not talking about sin enough. What they mean is you're not condemning enough sin and you're not condemning enough people for their sin. That's what they mean. But I don't do that. I focus on faith, hope, and love. I focus on forgiveness. I focus on the gospel. I focus on Christian freedom. And I do that because that's what Jesus did. Now, a lot of people mistakenly believe Jesus spent a lot of time calling out people's sins. But that's simply not true. He really only ever spent his time calling out two specific sins or types of sins: self-righteousness and hypocrisy. He very rarely, if at all, called out anyone else's sin or called out anyone else as being a sinner. Now, sometimes people point to the Sermon on the Mount, where indeed he does talk about some specific sins. He talks about murder, he talks about adultery, he talks about divorce, he talks about swearing oaths, and a couple of other things. Is he really calling out those sins? Or what is he doing? Well, let's take a look. All right, this is a relatively long sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, so we can't cover it all. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I'm in Matthew chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 21. Here's what Jesus says. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. Then again, in verse 27, he says this, if you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Then in verse 31, he says, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now he goes on and on. He covers a couple different other topics, and he goes into those a little more deeply. But you get the idea. As we start to look at that teaching from Jesus, we see he's not actually calling out the murderers and the adulterers and the divorcees and the people that swear oaths or whatever. The people he is actually calling out are the ones who think they have done none of those things. The ones who think that they are better than the people that have done those things. Those are the people that Jesus is calling out, and he's saying to them, you think you haven't murdered? You have. You think you haven't committed adultery? You have. You think you didn't commit a sin because you gave your wife a certificate of divorce? You did. He's calling out once again the hypocrites and the self-righteous. If you want a pastor that's going to preach the truth and not be afraid to preach the truth, this is the truth.